be here. We have a special event this afternoon called our Regional Gem Program, which I'll tell you about a little bit more in just a little bit. But first, on behalf of the Storytelling Association of California, we want to thank Pastor Aaron for making this possible, for making room for us here, for having the recording going, for being able to share this wonderful event with many, many people. And Pastor Aaron, I'm going to ask you to come up here, please. This is... Yes, so we just want to thank you so much for this beautiful, beautiful space. This is for you?
I just want to say it is our honor to be able to host you guys today, and really just a blessing to be able to hear the importance of storytelling. It is so important to listen to one another's stories, and so we are grateful for the storytelling that you do and for bringing this opportunity to us here, and we're so excited to celebrate Anne and to hear some stories today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, I want to tell you a tiny bit about our Regional Gem Program. This has been a part of Storytelling Association of California for a number of years. And the idea is to honor a storyteller who not only is a brilliant storyteller, but someone who has really worked hard to promote the art of storytelling in her or his community. Throughout the state, now throughout the world, we have the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to name our regional gems and then introduce this year's honoree. We started with Catherine Fairley, who's no longer with us, as just a beautiful storyteller. Then Kirk Waller, whom I believe is on screen, Tim Araneta, Marilyn McPhee, I'm telling it out of order. Marilyn McPhee, who is here with us, Barbara Clark, who's here with us, Michael McCarty, who's here with us, Joy Swift, who I believe is on screen. Who am I forgetting? Tim Araneta? Beezy Smith. And today, we get to add to our list of luminaries Anne Buxie, who many of you know. We alternate between Southern California and Northern California on the different years, and this year, it's Southern California. So Anne Buxie is our 2023 Regional Gem Award winner. We're so excited to be here. So we want to present you with this plaque, the 2023 Regional Gem Award, and we want you to have these flowers as well. Those are very heavy. That's beautiful. Someone took a good picture too. Thank you. I want to read this. I'd like to read this to folks, if you don't mind. With gratitude, appreciation, and recognition of her many years of service to the storytelling community of Southern California, as poet, storyteller, and host of the long-running quarterly Tales by the Sea showcase, the Storytelling Association of California honors Anne Buxie. Anne, from the time you started hosting storytelling concerts in your home, feeding ever-growing audiences with stories, music, poetry, and hot homemade soup. You brought joy and fellowship to hundreds. SAC thanks you for keeping the storytelling fire alive. Thank you so much. So without further ado, Anne Buxie, Regional Gem 2023.
Well, I'm going to tell some stories today about me as a married person. And the first one is called Found, sometimes known as Sometimes You Find What You Need. We'll let a couple people in now. Really, I wasn't looking for a husband. I was looking for a job. It was 1970. I just graduated from college in Claremont, California. My husband-to-be had just been discharged from the Army. Thanks to the Neighborhood Youth Corps, he was working at LA County in the Personnel Division, where a Black Vietnam vet meets fresh out of college girl from a small town in Arizona. Have you ever met someone with a face that cares, that absorbs you without ulterior motive? A face that's taken life in and gentled it. I don't know what Rick had gentled, and I don't know what it had cost him to be the man he was at 23, but it was there on his face and in his actions. He was the only county employee to come out from behind that counter and mix with us, the job-seeking public. Over the course of a few visits, we got to know each other. On one of those visits, he invited me to Venice Beach with a bottle of Akadama plum wine. And he suggested we move in together. And I agreed. Was I thinking about my future? About the consequences of an interracial relationship? Not really. This was my future. Call me naive or ignorant, but I'd never been exposed to racism. Not in Yuma, not by my folks. I heard Mom use a phrase once, man's inhumanity to man, but I'd never witnessed it. It had never touched my skin. There were times when Rick and I were together, we'd pass some sisters, and I'd feel hostility. A white girl with an eligible black man. I wasn't supposed to do that. But by the end of that month, we were moving my stuff out of that single unit in West LA to a one-bedroom apartment in Leimert Park. I'd drive to work in Westwood, and I'd often wonder how long it would take before I was not so aware of the color divide between me and my environment. And it took about 30 years to see past the glare and the suspicion of a color-intoxicated culture. Now in 1970, was it 70? No, it was 1973, we decided to make it official. Rick and I married in the preacher's backyard in Baldwin Hills. They say perspective takes two pairs of eyes. With 4 eyes, you can see around a problem. I knew Rick could help me see around the rest of my life. I trusted his goodness. So we stepped into each other's families. Bingo. I now had a slew of aunts and uncles and a pack of cousins. We grew to know each other gradually. I rode to church with Uncle Freddie one day. He owned a couple tire shops, and he was reminiscing. He said, I decided to be a wholesaler, but a white man called, advised me against it. I was beginning to see what racism could accomplish. Its inhumanity. By 1980, we were living in Silver Lake. Rick had quit his $1.25 an hour job at the county. He was a working artist now. 1980, we had our only child, a daughter. And I began a campaign to move. I hadn't been raised in smog. I didn't want to raise our daughter in air you could see. Every morning I call the Air Quality Management District for a pollution report. Most every morning that meant I'd be shutting up the house, closing windows. Rick said, you were a nuisance, but you were a sincere nuisance. My body is just buzzing with this. You were a sincere nuisance. Now I've lost my place. Isn't that something? I need Tina to give me a hint like I did when we were telling these stories.
Your daughter?
Well, Rick was a working artist now. He came home from the studio one day, and I said, "We're moving." And he remembered a place he'd never wanted to leave. It was 1968. He and a gaggle of other young conscripts were being bussed up north Pacific Coast Highway to Fort Ord for basic training. So he was being bussed up north for basic training. I'm sorry, I'm getting very buzzed.
Lower the note. Lower the note.
Yes, Michael, right.
We're loving your story.
Well, there's more to it.
Soon come.
Yeah,
Just talk to us, Ann.
yes.
We just love you.
Thanks, Ellen. So he looked out the bus window. On one side was the ocean, on the other, an empty field, mountains, a few homes. He thought, this is where I want to live. Don't tell me land can't call you back. 15 years later, Rick found a place for us on that piece of land in Malibu. Am I glad we moved here? The air was cleaner most of the time. I hadn't counted on how monochromatic Malibu was. Jill came home from elementary school one day, lay on the bed crying. "What's wrong, Jill? What happened?" All she'd say is, "You wouldn't understand. You're not black." Not black. Well, there was a color divide again, right in the heart of our family. Now, early on in our marriage, I noticed how Rick managed his public exposure. I like going to live events, storytelling, poetry, theater. Not Rick. If he had his druthers, he'd always prefer the company of his lifelong buddies, his cousins, or himself. With them, it was a safety zone, a DMZ. He'd always encourage me to go, but I knew it'd be a solo outing. There were times we were together. My folks had a dinner party for us once. Many of their friends and business associates were there. After the party, Dad said, "Rick, I noticed that you can talk to anybody about anything. That's remarkable." Rick told my dad, "Don, I'm just faking it." Dad said, "That's what's so remarkable." Interesting. Now, Jill must have been 9 or 10 at the time. I thought, we need a family vacation. So I planned one, a raft trip down the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. My idea of heaven. Less so for Rick. It was 126 one day. The river was in the 40s. Our first night out, we camped right by a rapid. Our first rapid, the one we would run the next morning, the one our guides had talked about, where a raft had overturned the week before. All night, that rapid was talking to Rick. All night, he was planning, how could I save Jill? It wasn't until the end of that week, back in our hotel room, safe, when I noticed Rick's beard. It had begun turning gray. He said, when your balls are in somebody else's grip, you want to make sure they like you. But what could he do? I mean, rapids, will be rapids. Then Jill piped up. Your vacations aren't vacations, Mom. You can't relax. Rick was 50 when he had heart surgery. That changed the nature of our relationship, how we leaned into each other. Rick had admitted, I'm a victim of my own eccentricities. After that surgery, he began what he called a dive into who I am. And so did I. I enrolled in graduate school. The rhythm of our marriage seemed to be composed of our adjustments to each other's dives and eccentricities. One thing we always enjoyed together was art. Making it, viewing it, discussing it. We'd stretch out rolls of canvas outside and begin, as Rick said, smearing paint. He might pass by my work occasionally and comment, needs more work. He never told me what to do, just do more. Kind of like expecting to find justice in the world, needs more work. I trusted his vision, so I kept at it. He told a friend of ours once, when describing our marriage, we've been on every ride in the carnival. But with 4 eyes, we've managed to know when to zig and when to zag. And we've kept believing in each other and in ourselves. At day's end, we might sit out under the palms, listen to the wind, watch the night absorb the light. Under the stars, in that quiet, we let the conversation wander where it will. In the face of those good nights, no matter how thin the day or how thick with trouble, we find what we need. We are gentled. This next story is about me and my in-laws. Over 30 years ago, it's called the Fitting Rooms. Over 30 years ago, I went to Bristow, Oklahoma for my in-laws' family reunion. Bristow's where they were all born. It's a town of about 4,500. It seemed as if everyone, at least in the African-American community, knew them, the Jacksons. Heard tell Bristow used to be called Jacksonville. Back when, those Jacksons were known as the Blue Hen Chicks. My mother-in-law told me that, and I asked her, Lula, what does that mean? Well, she didn't know. After she passed, I thought I'd try and find out. So I sat at the computer, called up the search engine, typed 3 words in the search bar, Blue Hen Chicks. Bingo. I had pay dirt. Evidently, that phrase arose over 200 years ago in the Revolutionary War. It gathered its meaning from a Captain Jonathan Caldwell. Caldwell commanded a company of men from Kent County, Delaware, but he also raised gamecocks, fighting chickens. Cockfighting was high entertainment then, kind of like football today, I guess. But those roosters fought to the death. Now, Caldwell's cocks were famous for winning fights. They were fierce, and he always maintained that no cock could be truly game unless it was brooded by a blue hen. Caldwell became that blue hen to his troops. He trained them to be fierce, to fight to the end. So when those Jacksons were called Blue Hen Chicks, it might make you pause. They were a flock to be reckoned. They knew their worth. They stood their ground. 3 things I noticed and I remember about Bristow. The color of the earth, fiery red. Churches, there was one in almost every neighborhood. And the corner gas station. The corner gas station sold watermelons. sweetest ones I ever tasted. I ate so much one day, it made me tipsy. I started chanting, I am a watermelon, I am a watermelon. Watermelons are happy creatures, and I ate so much watermelon to distract myself from the other goodies. The pound cake, the 7-Up cake, the coconut cake, the German chocolate cake, the upside down cake, and the cobblers.
Oh,
Yeah, of course, now I wish I could get my mouth on one of those cobblers, homemade cobblers. Or Uncle Jim's barbecue. When he fired up that 55-gallon drum, people began showing up, as if the aroma was invitation enough. We'd sit out in the shade, hoping to catch a breeze off the pond. After the eating and the swapping of stories and the sharing of memories, Aunt Jean and my mother-in-law Lula and I might ride to Sapulpa for some window shopping. That's how I found myself one day in a most unlikely place. A lingerie shop? But something red and lacy in the window caught my eye. I thought, why not? My daughter's voice in my ear, live a little, Mom. So in we went, and there were worlds of laces. Black, red, hot pink. I finally found a bra. A sales lady showed me to a fitting room. I took off my top and tried it on. I tried to try it on. It was way harder than bridling a horse. Then the sales lady knocked. Could I help you? Yes, please, come on in, I said. I'm having trouble figuring out how to fasten this. She came in, looked at me, and had 4 words. This is a garter. Well, no wonder, I said. That explains it. Thank you. She left, and I muttered to myself, really? Am I supposed to know this is a garter just because I'm female? No. Right then, I decided lingerie was too complicated. I would stick to underpants. But before that, over 40 years ago, I entered another fitting room when I married Rick, the fitting room of my marriage. I was 25. I had my ways. I suspected I needed some alterations, had a few loose ends. When I was angry, I would scream at Rick. His response was always the same. Silence. I mean, utter silence. He'd barely look at me. I might not know the difference between a bra and a garter, but I knew I had to find another way of communicating. So I did. But I also had opinions when I married Rick about this country. I thought the United States was the good guy, that we were always right. In this fitting room, with all my new in-laws, I was beginning to see things differently. They might not have known it, but they were all helping with my alterations, helping me find a truer fit in my life. There was Uncle Freddie. Our daughter must have been about 3 at the time. She and I went over to Aunt Jean's one Sunday. We were going to ride to church with him. We're dressed in our Sunday best. In walks Uncle Freddie, all 6.5 feet of him in his Sunday best, from tip to toe. Now, I don't think our daughter had ever seen shoes like the ones Uncle Freddie was wearing. She bent down, her behind up in the air, went eye to eye with those black patent leather shoes. And she announced, with all the authority of a toddler, I don't like those shoes. Well, Uncle Freddie heard that. He swept her off her feet, hugged her, told her, I love you anyway. I love you anyway. Then there's Cousin Michael. He believes in character management. He knows we all have more than one character living inside of us. He thinks they all need a chance to express themselves. He told me one day, Ann, you need to wear your hat backwards sometimes. My goody two-shoes self was happy to hear that. She was tired of running the show. Thank you, Michael, for blessing out that wear my hat backwards character. Then there's Uncle Jim. We spoke in 2005 after his stroke. He told me there are 3 things you can't replace: a mama, a wife, and a home. Then there's my mother-in-law, Lula. She showed me about boodling. Now, when you're boodling, it means you're doing exactly what you want to be doing, when you want to be doing it, with whom you want to be doing it, and taking as long as it takes to do it. She and her sisters might leave the house, say, we're going boodling, which meant you didn't know what they'd be getting up to. You didn't know where they were going. You didn't know when they'd be back. But you did know one thing: they'd be having a good time. Lula and I went boodling occasionally to the theater or window shopping or cafe. She'd treat me to a latte and remind me, take your time. She knew if I couldn't take my time to enjoy the pleasures in front of me, I wasn't boodling. Then there's her son, Ricky, my husband. I call him Buddha Buxie sometimes. You'll see. There must be a character in me named Nike Girl. Something needs doing, I just do it. Rick watches me racing around, doing this, doing that, doing it. He finally told me one day, don't just do something, stand there. You can't make something happen until you hear the full message. If you get out of sequence, it's not going to work. And some days I do feel disorderly, and I try to remember to stand there and compose myself. Now, all those aunts and uncles who migrated out from Oklahoma to California, raised families, opened businesses, furniture stores, tire shops, real estate service, tax service, a cafe. They all showed me in word and deed how to stand up for myself and how to smell a rat, and the importance of investing in myself and my family, because there are things you can't replace. All the aunts and uncles have passed on now, but I wanted you to know how glad I am they were there in that fitting room while my seams were being ripped and I was being restitched. Those blue hen chicks, they love me anyway. I'm a lucky girl. I'm a lucky girl. Plus, I know all these people. Yeah. So my last story I want to report on is an incident between Rick and me. It's called The Apology. So there was a time, many whiles ago, when I wanted an apology. Did I deserve one? Maybe, maybe not. But my feelings were hurt. I wanted one. I needed an apology. And so I waited. And Rick knew I was waiting, and he knew what for. Because I was frosty, there was a chill in the air. Several days passed. Rick came to the doorway of my home office, and I thought, now it's coming, the apology. And he starts talking about kites. I thought, is this some kind of segue into an apology? But I listened. He explained, kites have tails. Tails act as a drag. The drag stabilizes the kite so it won't spin or roll and crash. And then he walked away. That was the apology. No Q&A, no discussion. Evidently, he'd given the metaphor a lot of thought. Evidently, he expected me to apply it. But I was still a little fuddled, so I Googled kites. There are two forces that enable flight, lift and drag. They work together. Rick was right about the drag. It stabilizes the kite, but my feelings were still hurt because Rick had been such a drag on one of my bright ideas. That's how it happened, that metaphor, it slams you. He'd been such a drag. And I realized that maybe I didn't need an apology. That was it. And since then, I've looked at our marriage. Our whole marriage is a flight. I know I've flown places with him. I would never have gone otherwise. And in recasting this story to tell today, I gained new appreciation for those forces of lift and drag, how they're always present and fluctuating in a relationship. And I gained new respect for the power of metaphor, a metaphor to help you see something you wouldn't see otherwise. I mean, who knew Rick's 3-sentence mini lecture on kites would help me understand the need for and the benefit of drag? I never needed an apology. I needed the perfect metaphor, and Rick delivered it. And he still speaks in metaphor, and I'm glad for it because it deepens my thinking. So, there we are. We're flying now. That chill that was in the air, that chill is long gone. We're just two kites soaring through the skies of our lives, lifting and dragging as needed. Okay. Thank you all. You know, we've got some regional gem honorees here, and I wanted to invite some people up so that we could discuss storytelling. But if you all had any questions for me first, go ahead and ask them.
And I was just gonna say, that was great. It was marvelous. It was marvelous.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you. Yeah.
I really enjoyed that. Let's meet Rick.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know what? I really stumbled a while back because when I think Johnny came in, I'm not sure, I don't have my glass, he came in, but you had a scarf like my husband's. I thought you were my husband for a minute, Johnny. I thought you were my husband. I don't have my glasses on. And it just threw me for a minute because he doesn't show up because of his safety zone. I mean, I've had to understand it that way, that some people need that. Yeah. And I knew that many of you would understand that. Ellen, yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you've shared the story, if Rick has heard all these, he's lived the story, but has he heard your story, these stories that you just shared with us?
Yeah.
Yes, and I developed these stories in Barbara Clark's workshop, and Barbara Clark has been the one to tell me before, and her comment to me on a story needs more work. Because she used Rick's quote on me. That sly little So at any rate, yeah, Rick has heard them. I think he's heard those too. Yeah, because I practiced it. Yeah, he's aware of them.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And you know what, I've known you and Rick, I've never known your story. So it was so wonderful to hear about your life together and with Jill and just like your journey of navigating all that. So thank you.
Well, it's really lovely to have some people here who wanted to hear it. Thank you. You know, there was a quote I wanted to start this off with by a Uruguayan poet, Eduardo Galeano, and he says it so beautifully why we need these. He said, because every single one of us has something to say to the others, something that deserves to be celebrated or forgiven by another. That is the whole storytelling thing in a nutshell, the opportunity to celebrate and maybe even forgive, you know? So, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Kate.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Anne.
Hi,
It was
Kate.
wonderful. And my question is, yeah, I've noticed in your marriage you two have a great sense of humor, and you laugh with such gusto, and so does Rick. When you first met, did you both have that, your humor, or did it develop over the years together?
Oh, I know it developed. It's seasoned. I got to know him. He didn't speak in metaphor back then. Not that I was aware of the way I am now, the way I really appreciate looking at life like that and hearing someone else speak like that. Yeah, no, you know, any long relationship seasons you and you get to know each other in the ways. And of course, some of that laughter it's so important. That's why it's so nice when you see Michael McCarty come to a concert. You know you're gonna get lifted up. Yes, yes. So anyway, yeah, that's it for the questions for me. So now, Michael and Barbara, would you like to come up and we can, and Marilyn, we can talk more story up here. Yeah, come on up here. And I'll move this so that we can pass this around. Good.
You're gonna sit down somewhere.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great opportunity to ask some of these people questions because they're past gym winners and they've got so much seasoned wisdom in them. So this is Michael McCarty. Sarah Armstrong, who is the president of SAC now, the Storytelling Association of California, and Marilyn McPhee, whom I've heard tell also, and Barbara Clark, who tells and leads workshops, and probably many other things.
Whole bunch of stuff.
Whole bunches of stuff, as Michael would say. So who would like, if you all want to ask any questions, please do. And I hope that we have time to get together afterwards and get to know each other more because they're wonderful. Ellen?
I have a question. Okay, so I tell personal stories, but my daughter told a personal story about me without my permission. And I'm just wondering, it was pretty flattering, okay, but I'm just wondering if you all have been on the receiving end of this experience, this art form.
Well, I haven't been on the receiving end too much, but I certainly tell plenty of stories about people in my family, and I think they indulge me. I don't know, maybe that's where the forgiveness comes in, do you suppose? What do you have to say about that, Barbara?
I tell only personal stories. And I tell personal stories about any and everybody, and if they don't like it, that's too bad. Because they're personal stories, they are my stories. And if somebody disagrees with my version of something, then let them tell their own version.
Tell it, girl. You tell it.
No sympathy here.
No sympathy. No sympathy.
My daughter My daughter tells a story about it. We both tell a story about an incident that happened when she was about to turn 18 and she was smelling herself. Y'all know what I'm talking about. She thought she was all grown up. And she told it so well. Years ago, I gave a workshop at the National Storytelling Conference on telling the teens and teaching teens to tell. This story happened when she was a teenager, so I had her write the story up, and it became a handout for my workshop. Yeah, so, by the way, my daughter today, she's at a cat conference. My daughter has 22 cats. And she's curling the cat lady, and she is famous in the cat world. And she got cat tails.
Cat tails, oh.
Other questions, other comments?
Yes.
Well, I'm often asked to tell personal stories, and they're not funny. They're very serious. Growing up, I tell stories about growing up in Louisiana, growing up in a segregated society, environment. And other people will come up and they'll tell funny stories. And I say, I want to tell a funny story. And I don't know how to make these personal stories funny. Because, I mean, there's nothing funny about being beaten with a chain when I'm on the road going to the grocery store for my mother, but I'm trying to figure out how do I make people laugh?
Well, you have to tell a funny story, as opposed to telling a story and making it funny. So you need something that's and then expand on that. Because I tell heartbreaking stories also. Crushing stories. Barbara.
A story doesn't have to be funny. What makes you think you need to be funny?
I think people enjoy funny stories better.
People also enjoy serious stories if they have something to tell them, if they have a message or something that they can connect to. The whole idea with personal stories is that the teller must connect with the audience. It doesn't have to be funny. It doesn't have to be sad. It doesn't have to be anything except to connect to the people in the audience. Let me just demonstrate for a moment, if I can be indulged. When I headed to college on the campus of Howard University on my very first day of senior orientation, the only other person who attended my high school introduced me to a young man and said, I want you to meet my friend, Ray Clark. I said, oh, another Raymond, huh? Because his name was Raymond. And the young man said to me, if my name had been Raymond, he would have said so. Well, I was so put off by this attitude that I thought, well, I'll certainly avoid him in the present. This is not somebody I want to have to spend any time with. 2 years later, we were married. Now, that's a very short story, and it doesn't start off very funny, but the ending makes it funny because of how the story was resolved. So it very much depends on how you build your story, whether or not it connects with your audience. And I gotta tell you, I've had a lot of people in the audience who love that little story about my husband.
I love it.
So I just have to tell you, so I sat down first behind Ruby, and then I realized we were kind of contorting ourselves to talk. And so I moved next to her, and I introduced myself, and she said, well, I'm Ruby Simpkins. And I said, I heard a story that you told. It was years ago. We can't even figure out exactly where it was, because we're not in the same place very often. I didn't remember her face, but I did remember her name, and boy, do I remember her story. And it was not a funny story, but it has stayed with me for that long because it really spoke to me. So don't worry if you're not funny. If your stories are not funny, that's not always the point.
You know, and I think what Barbara said about the resolution is interesting. You can start out with whatever you want to tell, but how are you going to resolve it? You can resolve it in a way, you know, in a way that you found some humor in it, or you can resolve it with the grief. So it does depend on how you want to resolve it, because we all resolve our experiences in all these different ways.
And I would say bringing depth is important. You know, if you introduce something deep that people can relate to, it's meaningful.
I had a guy, and for those of you who don't know, I've been working in prisons since 2014.
Could you take the mic, please?
I've been working in prisons in 2000. I was trying to keep my voice down so I didn't hurt anybody's ears. I've been working in prisons, and I had a guy. Everybody was telling these funny stories, and this guy comes up. He says, "Mike, I'm sorry, I don't have any funny stories." And he told this heart-wrenching story. He and a buddy were out. They got confronted by a gang. The buddy got shot. He's at the hospital with his buddy who's having his surgery. His cell phone rings. His pregnant girlfriend calls. Something's wrong. Loses the baby. All right. Wasn't nothing funny in there. But that story touched everyone in that room. And I always remember there were two guys in the back of the room. They weren't disruptive, but generally when somebody was up telling the story, they were sort of between themselves. They shut up and they locked in on his story. So whatever story, if you tell a funny story, fine.
Amen.
Tell the story from here.
Amen.
That's what matters. Tell that story from there. All the way to the back.
Yeah.
I was wondering, personally, I've told thousands, maybe 1 million stories, because that's what I do.
Johnny, let me give you the mic.
Okay. My name is Johnny Rutledge. I'm from Sarasota, Florida. I'm here in Malibu for three months.
Oh, I thought you came just for the show.
I really enjoyed meeting Ann. It was so powerful. She was more than a moment to me. It seems as though I knew her all my life. When I looked at her, I think I fell in love. She began to speak to me as my mother, my grandmother, my wife, and maybe even my daughter. And I said one word to her, and I think she captured that word. That's the question I would have for this panel, because I've never practiced story, but my stories are being told all over the world, especially the prison stories, as you mentioned, the slavery stories. My grandfather was born in 1852, and his father was the owner of the plantation, Alabama, and I have record of this. And my father was the last son of 42 kids by my grandfather.
Damn.
So the uniqueness of these stories is my life. They're not just, so when I heard someone say, practice this, the more you practice, the better you get at a thing. I think it was Mark Twain that made me realize practicing something actually takes away from it. And I would say that because my most genuine efforts is when I don't practice. I like to fall on my face. I like for tears to come out of my eyes. I like for the emotions to take me where I've never been, even though the story I've told 1,000 times. But when I hear these type of stories, especially Ann's story, I see beyond the story she told. And I actually begin to fit into her life as if though her husband is not only a story, but he's a ghost on the stage next to her. So it is very much, to me, the most blessed thing is to meet someone like an Ann, because she invited me here. And being a little late, I would have never believed that she would have been startled, or she would have hesitated, because she's the professional. But I felt like maybe that was something that I needed to bring to her attention. And normally in these crowds and type of events, I leave space for those that may desire to speak and would want to be known and heard. And I don't have to be known and heard. But I justify it by saying If you can answer that question, why is practicing the story important, or is it important to tell a good story?
Well, I can say it was important for me, Johnny, because as I kept practicing, which really means just reviewing it and going over and over it, more was revealed every time I visited this material. And call that practice if you want, editing, whatever you want, but that's what I needed to do to get it until it congealed in my mind exactly what it is I did want to convey to the listeners. So it was important to me to do that practice. And of course, I got stuck a few times. Barbara's seen that happen to me before. But that happens to me sometimes. So, but I just think this material is so important that I want to milk it fully. And to do that, I need to edit, rehearse, review, whatever word you want to use, to do that again and again, to get down deep, Weezy, as you were saying, to go as deep as I can to scrape the bottom. I don't know, what is anybody want to say?
Sarah. I don't tell personal stories, I tell traditional stories. And for me, I need to practice, I need to do research, I need to put myself in the place of each character and each scene to make the connection with the people I want to tell stories to. Because I tell stories because I want to make connections. And so for me, as you've said, Anne, it's important to go as deep as I can to understand myself, what the message is, to be able to convey it, or hopefully convey it, to my audience.
Eileen?
I'm just, for clarification, what's the difference between a traditional story and a personal story?
A personal story is from your own experience, telling something from your own experience. A traditional story is like folk and fairy tales that have been around for a long time. So though I'm particularly enamored of those because of the messages that have been so important to people for so many years. So the ones that speak to me, again, are the ones that I want to share and make connections with other folks.
Oh, Lydia, the question is more related. He thinks, well, in his case, he doesn't feel the need to practice because there are people that are spontaneous and they can handle that. But there's some of us that can't. So I'm so impressed with Anne because she had 3 stories. I have a hard time trying with 1. So my question is, what do you do to remember your stories? I practice, but how do you practice? My husband calls me crazy because he hears me out loud talking to myself. So I wonder if you do that.
Let's let Barbara and Marilyn and you answer.
Excuse me. I think it's very important to practice. In fact, it's necessary to practice if you're going to do a good job of delivering your story. First of all, the story must be properly structured. You can't just get up and stand in front of an audience and talk off the top of your head and expect to have a well-developed story. The story must be structured and developed like any other written document. If you were going to write a letter to your congressman, you wouldn't just sit down with a piece of paper and just start jotting down stuff. You would think about it. You might take notes. You might rewrite it 3 or 4 times. You might read it over to somebody else to listen to see what they think, and then rewrite it and re-edit it to get a perfect idea on paper of what it is you want to say. Well, no less is to be done with a successful story. It must be structured. It must have a beginning, a middle, and an end. It must have description and dialogue. It must have some kind of empathy in it. You must have all of those elements in it if it's to be a successful story. And once you have it developed on paper, then you start to deliver it verbally. And you listen to yourself. And if it's not saying what you wanted to say, you go back and you re-edit it again. And then you practice it again until you get it perfect. And that's the way you get a good story developed. I had one of my students return to me after doing a performance at Ann's program. And she said, a lady came up to me after the show and said, you must be one of Barbara Clark's students. The lady said, why did you think so? She said, because your story was so well developed. Now, that's why you practice. That's why you rehearse. That's why you redo it until you get the story to be as perfect as you can make it. Now, as for personal stories, I tell only personal stories. I don't tell stories that other people have written. I tell stories that I write myself about my life, about my history, the history of my family, about the history of my culture. A woman once asked me after a show, why do you only tell personal stories? And I said to her afterwards, because she wasn't being friendly, she was being critical. I said to her, I tell personal stories because they say something about me, about my family, about my culture, and about my heritage. And those things matter, and they matter because I matter.
And you know, I will say that the more I practiced, who was it that said, Lydia, the more I practiced, especially for this concert, because I wanted to try and, you know, do it well, because I owed it to the material, first of all. I owed it to Rick and his family, and I owed it to the people who would be listening. But I found as I kept rehearsing, and I don't know if you all find this, but it got into my body in a way. I wanted my body to be comfortable with it, not just standing there, but my body, my body was expressing it also, which was interesting, because I often just stand, but I felt comfortable with it all over my body, not just in my head and my heart, but in my body. And that was also interesting that happened, because I've never prepared so much as for this concert. And I noticed that it had repercussions in my body. I was more comfortable with it. I don't know if anybody could tell, but I could.
It's 4 o'clock.
Oh.
It's 4 o'clock. Which is the official end of our gathering. However, for all of you who are here, we hope all of you come over and join us in the hall for some refreshments and further conversation. I'm really sorry to cut this off because it's awesome. But again, I want to thank Ann Buxie, our 2023 McCarty, and Pastor Aaron, and everyone from the church. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
I was shocked a little bit.